Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Modern Leadership, a very special 100th episode of the podcast. It is so great to be with you. Here we are, the end of 2018. We're kicking off 2019, and the timing is just perfect. I mean, we hit 100 episodes today, which is no small feat. As you all know, we started 4 years ago, 2014, with episode 1 of the Family Before Fortune podcast. We ran that for 119 episodes. Then we switched over to Modern Leadership, and now here we are all the way back up to triple digits, 100 episodes of Modern Leadership. And it's been such a great journey. It is so good to spend this time with you every week. And I've really had a blast. I mean, look, we've recorded over 200 and some odd episodes. We've interviewed over 100 guests on this show. The feedback, the fun, the excitement, all the great things that we've been doing, just a great time to celebrate. And so today I want to do something a little bit special. Today, I want to do a 100th episode special, but before we jump into that, because it is the very end of 2018 and the very beginning of 2019, I want to ask you how your goals are going. Have you set your goals for 2019? What are you doing today to ensure that 2019 is going to be your best year ever? What are you doing today to prepare yourself for a great experience? Because what I want you to do is at the end of 2019, pretend like we're December 28th of 2019. I want you to be sitting there thinking about the year you just had and considering all the great stuff that you did, how you've excelled, the accomplishments, the goals that you've set and accomplished. But that's only going to happen if you kick off 2019 the right way. And so here we are. What are you going to do to ensure that 2019 is your best year ever? And just as I was preparing for this episode, I wrote down a couple of things that I wanted to share with you. To make 2019 the best year ever, these are the 4 steps that I want you to take. All right? Step number 1, start with a goal. You've heard us talk in the past about SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, SMART goals. You've also heard me talk about BHAGs, right? Big, hairy, audacious goals. Push yourself, 10x your growth, but you got to start with a goal. You got to start somewhere. So make that goal specific. Make it measurable. Make sure it's realistic. You can attain it. It's relevant to what you want to accomplish, the person you want to be at the end of the year, and then, of course, time-bound. Set some time constraints on it. So start out with the goal-setting process. That's step number 1. Number 2, create a plan of action. What do you need to accomplish on a quarterly basis, on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, on a daily basis in order to achieve the life and lifestyle that you want to achieve by the end of 2019? It doesn't just happen, right? Nobody falls their way onto the top of Mount Everest. Nobody accomplished a goal or became the success that they wanted to become by just wandering around aimlessly. So step number 2 is to create a plan of action, how you're going to accomplish the goals that you have. Number 3, put in place some accountability. The only way that you're going to be able to get to where you want to go is if you hold yourself accountable. You've heard, as we talked about, the CIA of influence, C being conviction, I being irresistibility, A being accountability. You know that the only way you can become who you want to be, the only way that you can power through the messy middle and do the things that you need to do is if you're accountable. So what are you going to do to stay accountable? How are you going to keep yourself on task and moving in the right direction? Do you have an accountability partner? Do you have some sort of journal or record keeping that keeps you on task? What is your stick or what is your carrot to make sure that you accomplish your goals in 2019? And then finally, celebrate success. You cannot continue on in your goals, going through the messy middle, unless you take time to celebrate. Give yourself that opportunity to celebrate a little bit. And that, my friends, are the 4 steps that I wanted to share with you today about accomplishing the best year ever for 2019. Step number 1, start with a SMART goal. Step number 2, create a plan of action. Step number 3, put in place accountability. And number 4, celebrate your success. All right. Now, for today, I'm so excited for this. This is something we've never done before, and I've wanted to do this for a long time, but we've never done it, and today was the day. So here we go. I am bringing back 5 of my very favorite guests to the podcast. Over the last 100 episodes, I identified 5 of my most favorite, and they are Otto Scharmer, Rabbi Daniel Lapin, Whitney Johnson, Steve Shallenberger, and Scott Beebe. And what I wanted to do was break out a little bit of some of the things that we talked about and share again with you these messages that these great guests shared. And so our very first guest today, Otto Scharmer. You'll remember him from episode 77. Otto is a senior lecturer at MIT and the co-founder of the Presencing Institute. If you recall that episode, we talked about redefining leadership as a term of art. Is leadership really the name that we want to continue to call this act that we're going through? And then we dive into the 3 criticisms of leadership. So take a listen.
And it's interesting. So also, I think that the title of your show is around leadership, right? And I'm just now coming out of a meeting of the leadership faculty here, the Leadership Center at MIT, and so there was, once in a while, kind of you have a new director coming in, and then so what are we trying to do, and what's the focus, that kind of conversation. And one of the conversation topics on the table is, should we still call it leadership or something else? And I think that's like an interesting indicator for what we are talking about, that, at the current MIT Leadership Center, you have a conversation, should we call this thing leadership or something else? It's work in progress. It's no conclusion yet. But I think the maybe more interesting than what the actual conclusion in this case will end up being is why is it a question in the first place? And I think when you look into the landscape of leadership, and I have been, I'm working with different organizations and governments, big and small, sometimes more traditional companies or governmental organizations, and sometimes more on the startup and more innovative side of things. What I'm noticing is kind of to some of the audiences I'm working with, you can use the word leadership, and in others you can't. So instead of leadership, you would use words like change maker, pioneers, kind of basically, I think change makers is kind of the most widely used.
And one of the thoughts that we talk about on this show is that leadership is influence. Was there any conversation about leadership being influence or using that as kind of a synonym?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think influence and change making, that is certainly at the core of that. I would say there are like 3 main criticisms of, how leadership currently is experienced. And I'm sure that many, people kind of listening to this show kind of will resonate with that. The first one is that way too often leadership is seen and taught, particularly at business schools, as only the feature of an individual rather than a systemic feature. So in other words, it's kind of it's a characteristic of a person rather than the capacity of a system. And secondly, kind of it's hierarchical. So when you talk about leadership or leaders, most people associate that with the person at the top. And that is not really in sync with many of the challenges we face in organizations today, which really require you to do something very different, which is distributed leadership, which is kind of a leadership as you could say, what is leadership? Leadership is the capacity of a system to sense and realize its best future, right? So it's the capacity of a system to change, kind of to sense and actualize its best future. And so it's the capacity of a system. It's not just kind of what one person does or doesn't do. And everyone who works in a real organization, of course, knows what a single person can do in an organization today is very little. For all the more complex challenges that we face, it's a much more complex phenomenon. And in fact, kind of in most even middle and upper management jobs today, the same phenomenon is true, which is that you cannot successful in your job unless you manage to influence people outside of your control. So not people who report to you, but people in other parts of the organization, so that they change their behavior one way or another. And so if you can't use hierarchy for that, and if say you can't bribe them with money, what's left? It's basically the quality of your relationship. It's the quality of your communication. It's the quality of your listening. I think that's kind of the main asset that we have and that we try to cultivate. And that's why leadership in many contexts today looks very different than maybe in the past it has been conceived of and taught.
And as you were talking about this, that was the thought that was going through my mind is how has leadership shifted over time? Because the first thing that you talked about as a criticism of leadership is that it's sole, it's single, it's one person. And I would agree with you. I think that's maybe a little bit slower to change. I think that still there's this perception that leadership, that there is a leader and then there's followers. But the second one where you talk about hierarchical, it almost seems like that has, over the last, let's say 10 or 15 years, been a topic of conversation. A lot of authors are writing about, being able to lead from the bottom up or being able to lead from, 360-degree leadership and things like that. Now, what was the third criticism of leadership that that we're facing?
I think the third one is that it's missing the purpose. Leadership for what, right? And when you look at what great leaders do, almost all examples that come to mind, you see individuals or groups or communities of leaders who are inspired by a purpose, inspired by the passion around what they do. Think about Steve Jobs, think about Nelson Mandela, think about many other people. So, but that's, when you look at the more technical notion, kind of how leadership is being taught at business schools, that's what's often missing. And related to that, kind of the connection, the deeper personal connection and the deeper connection to purpose, related to that is another aspect, which is the current crisis of the larger system. So we live in a moment of disruption. We live in a moment where not only technology is disrupting our lives, but where there is kind of major environmental issue, major social and societal. I mean, here in the United States, as you know, we live in a moment where basically society is falling apart, is falling into subgroups that, have the greatest difficulties to even talk with each other. So we live in a very kind of dramatic moment.
So what do you think? Does the term leadership really encapsulate all that we talk about, or does it need to be changed? It's an interesting debate, and I love to hear that the great minds at MIT are talking about this. All right, now, in episode 14, we introduced America's Rabbi, Rabbi Daniel Lapin, and his great book, Thou Shalt Prosper. The book talks about 10 commandments of prospering and is a fascinating deep dive into the mindset of wealth. This book was our Modern Leadership Book Club book back in May of 2017, so it's been a little while. I recommend grabbing a copy of this book. So in this episode, one of the things we talked about is we're living in a time that there's this cultural war on wealth. And so take a listen.
We're living in a time in the United States of America where there is a cultural war on wealth. What I mean by that is that there are certain expressions that are so common today from politicians and from others that if I were to just say the first part of the expression, most people can complete them. For instance, the rich must pay their fair share. Okay. How do you define the rich? Nobody bothers. Politicians don't want to define the rich because tomorrow it will be you. Politicians do not want to define what fair represents. How much, tell me how much you want me to pay. But whatever it is, this is designed to make everyone else, take their money because they're bad guys, because the fact that they've got money is evidence of their malfeasance. So that's one. Or how about the expression, have you heard where somebody gives a charitable gift, and I almost always hear a commentator saying, oh, it's so nice to see them giving back to society.
Yeah.
So that means when a wealthy philanthropist gives charity, he's giving back to society. Well, you understand that means that while he was making the money in the first place, he must have been ripping it off from society. And one thing after another, you get these notions. I'll tell you where else. Entertainment. Who commits the majority of violent crime in popular entertainment? I'll tell you one thing. It's not the people who commit the majority of violent crime in the United States of America. The people who do it on television and on movies, the villains, the real bad guys and villains are rich white men, almost without exception. Going back to the James Bond movies, the villains, that's always, in other words, the culture, people have been conditioned to believe that rich is evil, synonymous. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because of a very fundamental principle that I teach, which is nobody can truly succeed at any enterprise that deep down in his heart he considers to be morally reprehensible. And so once you have been indoctrinated to believe that making money is somehow greedy and it's bad, it makes it very hard for you to do it properly yourself. You see, the problem is that in the same way that, in May 1953, Edmund Hillary climbed Everest for the first time. Now, I mean, since then, nearly 1,000 people have climbed Everest. And the question is and I'm not saying it's easy, but I mean, it's obviously not impossible. So how come it was such a big deal when he did it? Why did nobody else do it before? And the answer is just like the 4-minute mile that Roger Bannister broke in 1954. Why, today every college athlete does a 4-minute mile. Why didn't anyone do it before? And the answer is the same in both cases. Nobody believed that it could be done. And when you don't believe something could be done, you simply are handicapped terribly and fatally from doing it. And so when you don't believe that making money can be done morally, then you're not going to be able to do it, because our desire to see ourselves as upright, decent human beings is paramount and profound. And so the overwhelming majority of people today believe that making money is a function of greed. I profoundly dislike it when college graduates are told at commencement day ceremonies, there's always somebody who comes along with a speech and says how, it's wonderful, you should think of going into government, and that way you can serve people and you can really do good. No, don't do that. If you go into government, there's just another 10 fingers in my wallet. I don't want you to go into government. There's enough people in government. I want you to go into business and make jobs for people and find ways to improve my life by providing me with goods and services that I never even knew about. Don't go into government. Go into business. But everybody's been conditioned, indoctrinated to believe that if you want to go into business and make money, you're a greedy person. So one of these foundational things, and again, you speak about that pharmacy rep, she was very handicapped until she realized, and we were able to help her see the extent to which she was serving God's other children. And that's really what making money is all about.
The mindset of wealth is such a powerful force. And that's why, as I said earlier, I highly recommend give this book a read. It's so valuable. And of course, I'm going to link up the show notes for when we did this for the book club and we really dove into it even further so that you'll be able to check it out. Our next guest was a 2-time guest over the last 100 episodes because I just love Whitney Johnson and what she's doing. We had her on episode 24 to talk about her book, Disrupt Yourself. And then we had her back in episode 76 for her newest book, Build an A-Team, which is all about applying the principles of Disrupt Yourself into like a business building, hiring strategy type of thing. And in this episode, we dive into the 7 principles of surfing the S-curve of learning. And so take a listen. Let's talk about what these 7 principles of this S-curve of learning are?
Yeah, so the first one is to identify the right kinds of risks. And the way you think about this when you're a hiring manager is we tend to like to hire the way we've always hired. Someone may move or leave. And so you look at the job description and you try to hire exactly what you hired before. And one of the ways you can take the right risks is to be willing to say, okay, is that what we really need? Like maybe there's something that we need that we don't even realize that we need. And this person that left, it's giving us a huge opportunity. The other way you can take a market risk when it comes to hiring is we tend to want to get the most qualified person on the face of the planet, when in fact, that's not the person who's maybe going to do the best job. And so you can take a market risk by hiring where no one else is hiring. You can hire people who are actually internal that you've never looked at before because they've become like wallpaper to you. You can hire people who are on-ramping, who are coming back into the workforce. People who have been getting a crash course or a master class, however you want to think about it, in soft skills because they've been taking care of parents or children. Hire people that are boomerangers, people that you've worked with before, they've left, and you felt a little bit like, oh, that boyfriend, that girlfriend, they jilted me, I don't want them back. But the fact is you can work with them and they've been getting all these skills that someone else has been paying for. So boomerangers can make a lot of sense. And then finally, be willing to take a look at people who are self-taught. A lot of people in the United States will not ever have college degrees, but there's a subset of those people who are self-taught, who teach themselves, who take initiative. Be willing to consider those people as well. And so that's one way that you can build an A-team. You hire where no one else is hiring, and it's taking on market, rather competitive risk. So that's a starting point. Just remember is that time plus competence equals boredom. And so while you can hire people who are in the sweet spot of their learning curve at the high end of the curve, that's absolutely fine. Just understand that you're only going to have them because you really can only be on one curve at most for 4 years. So if you've hired someone who's in the middle or at the high end, then you're maybe going to get 6 months, a year, 18 months at most. And so be aware that within that 18 months, they're going to be bored and ready for something new to do. So are you going to be willing to let them move on, help them do that gracefully and graciously, et cetera? So the number 2 is to play to your distinctive strengths. And the thing that I would say here is, as an employee, we oftentimes don't know what our strengths are because they're things that we do so reflexively well. They're so easy for us. We don't value them because we don't tend to value things that come easily for us. So that's on the part of the employee. But as an employer, one of your jobs is to be able to identify those strengths, to recognize that you might hire someone initially not quite into the right seat because they're going to lead with what they do well, not with what they do best. And so that first 3 to 6 months is you want to be really observing closely, like what's their actual superpower, and be willing over time to move them around. Now, the tough part is that when you do decide that you want to move them around, they may resist it because they're going to feel like, wait, they want me to go back and do that easy thing? Like they're demoting me. They must not like me. What you're really doing is you're saying to them, I've spotted your superpower. And if you're willing to own this superpower and put yourself into stretch situations using this superpower, then you're going to really be able to make a contribution. And so that's part of your job as a leader, as a manager, is to not only identify that strength, move people into a role where they can play to that strength, say to them, I value it, therefore you should too, and your contribution will be greater as a consequence. Yeah, number 3 is a willingness to impose thoughtful constraints. One of the things that we know from the law of physics is that you have to have friction. Nothing moves without friction. It's very counterintuitive, and yet it's true. It might be nice to stand on ice, but you can't get anywhere if you don't have the friction. And it's the same with people. Once people get into the sweet spot of their learning, which is that steep part of the curve, it's easy to say, well, they're doing a good job, I'll just let them be. But that's actually the time where they need friction, and friction in the form of challenges, friction in the form of stretch assignments, et cetera. And so what I would say is you impose those thoughtful constraints by giving them assignments that are hard, but not too hard. So the Goldilocks assignments. And it's interesting because when people are in this sweet spot, they're doing a good job. And so it's easy to ignore them and not pay attention to them because they're not a problem child. And what I would say is this is a huge opportunity for you. First of all, you don't want them to become a problem child because you're ignoring them. But more importantly, once you've gotten them into that sweet spot and they're playing to their strengths, if you will impose thoughtful constraints, thoughtful challenges in terms of having them do things in, less time than they've done before, or give them a really challenging assignment where there's the risk of failure, then you're basically putting them into a proverbial box that they have to get out of. And that's going to cause them to be innovative for them and innovative on behalf of the company. So that's what the thoughtful piece is. It's the Goldilocks, hard, but not too hard. The next one is a willingness to step back as a way to move forward. And I touched on this just briefly, and maybe I'll tell you a quick story around that to really illustrate this point. This idea of playing to your strengths. So there was a fellow by the name of John Cave, and he works at the NFL. And he, over the last couple of years, has really advanced the game of advanced technology for the NFL. And yet I wonder if this wouldn't have happened had it not been for his boss, Michelle McKenna Doyle, who said, you know what, you've got these strengths, you're managing all the systems. What you're really good at is building things. And so the step back here is she took a lot of his responsibility away so that he could have the bandwidth, the emotional and these, intellectual bandwidth to build things. And so sometimes you've got to take a step back, have fewer assignments or different kinds of assignments in order to catapult or slingshot forward. And so as a manager or a boss, you're going to have to manage that and persuade them that step back is actually a slingshot for them. It's not, in fact, a demotion. The next one, this is number 5. It's to give failure its due. So, not all failure can be sidestepped, and, it shouldn't be. There's going to be times when people have been a star performer in the past and now they're not. Sometimes it's because they're not working, but I would argue that frequently they aren't a star performer because you've moved them and it's not the right curve. And that's, that happens. It's just like you try products and you try different markets. Sometimes, one market sticks and one market doesn't. It's the same with people. You move them around, they're star performer. This role didn't quite work. Okay, let's move them to somewhere else. What I would say is that frequently with failure, when you're managing people, is that they attach that failure, and you used Zig Ziglar earlier, I'm going to quote him now, is failure is an event, not a person. And so often we attach failure to our identity. And so oftentimes as a manager, your job is to say, okay, this didn't work. Now my job is to encourage you and say, get back on the horse, keep going. This role maybe not be right. Let's move you around. This project didn't work. Let's keep going. And what I would say is, as a boss, if you're not willing to let people who work for you fail, because we're all willing to let people fail all the time, if you think about it, it means there's something else going on. And so you've got to analyze psychologically what's happening. But overall, you give it its due by understanding that if you can take the shame out of it, failure is just someone putting what's gone into their brain in action, testing it. Is it working or not? Moving on. What's the ROI? Keep going. Move up the curve. Number 6, I think I've skipped something. Let's just think for a second. Okay, we said number 1 was right risks. Number 2 was strengths. Number 3 was constraints. Number 4, we missed battle entitlement. Oh my goodness. Okay, we have to back up for a second because that's like a big, big one. And battling entitlement is this belief that as a manager, it's like everything's humming, right? Your margins are expanding, your revenue's growing, your team's humming, you're humming. And battling entitlement as a manager is, I built this team, I deserve a fiefdom. And so now it's time for someone on your team to jump to a new curve because at the top of the curve, and you don't want to let them go because you deserve a fiefdom. And so one of the biggest, I would say this is the sneaky saboteur of innovation because we don't want to let people go. And yet, if if we're really going to be innovative, yes, our people are sometimes entitled, but we as managers are as well. So we just had to light touch that. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5 was step back to grow. Number 6 was failure. And number 7 is to be discovery driven. As a disruptor, you're in search of a yet to be defined market. You're trying to play where other people haven't played. You don't know what that looks like. And so as a manager, the way you want to think about this with your people is to recognize that you're going to have them try one role, and it may work, it may not work. And so if you think about the theory of disruption, the odds of success when you play where no one else is playing are 6 times higher, but that's still 36%. 6% to 36%, there's still 64% chance it's not the right curve. So there's a lot of iteration that goes on with people. And one thing that I think is really interesting, if you look at the Utah Jazz, which did very well this season, their coach, Quinn Snyder, he has lots and lots of different configurations, like 22 different starting lineups, because he's trying to figure out how to optimize his available resources, which in this case is people. And so as a leader, as a manager, what you want to do, bring people in. You think they're good at one thing, test that. Are they in fact good at this? And as you get more and more familiar with what they're doing, be willing to discover your way to finding the exact right curve for them. All this assumes that they're hard workers. But once you know that they are, then you iterate until you find the right role. So the top of the S curve on the one hand is exciting because you're on the top of this mountain. And so there's this vista to be able to examine all that you've been able to achieve. At the same time, because you're at the top, you are now know what you're doing. And because you know what you're doing, what's happening in your brain is you're no longer learning. And when you're no longer learning, you get bored. And so if you don't jump to do something new, this mountaintop, this plateau quickly becomes a precipice. And if you don't jump, then you might get pushed off. So you can actually precipitate your own demise. And so for you as a manager, what you want to do is instead of saying, they're a master, this is fantastic, you say to yourself, they're a master, I'm in trouble. So I've got to figure out, what are we going to do? Because they're bored now. So am I going, and so they might leave, or as you said earlier, they might get bored and complacent and stay. So what do? Well, in an ideal world, you find a new curve for them to jump to, ideally within your team, if not on your team, inside of your organization. And if not inside of your organization, then you help them find something with a client or with a vendor. They may not even be able to do any of those things. But if you're willing to develop people, then you become a talent magnet. And what I would argue is then you not only build one A team within your company, but over a career, you build vast networks of A teams because you've had all these people who learned and grew and developed because of you.
You know, lately I've thought a lot about that principle 5, a willingness to step back in order to move forward, to build momentum. And I'm reminded when I was climbing Mount Shasta, and the strategy that was taught to us was, kind of get this rock going so that you had this momentum to propel yourself forward up the mountain. And I love this idea of, how we can move forward, how we can build big momentum and get ourselves going forward. And sometimes that may require taking a step back. And that is why it's been on my mind a lot lately. Our 4th guest today is a great new friend, Steve Shallenberger, a longtime author who successfully bought, founded, and ran 11 companies during his career. His newest book is The Transformation Challenge, but for this interview, I really just dove into his bestseller, Becoming Your Best, The 12 Principles of Highly Successful Leaders. Enjoy.
Well, that's a great question, Jake. So that's a good entree, actually, into the first major book that I wrote, Becoming Your Best, The 12 Principles of Highly Successful Leaders. I mentioned it was based on 40 years of research. And some of my early companies, when I was pretty young, 26, 27, and had several hundred employees, and particularly the sales reps would come and say, how can I be among the very top producing people here in the company? Or a manager might come and say, how can I be the best manager? And this really initiated within me a desire to know the answer. And so I began a research that I thought would take a few years, but it took much longer. And what I was looking for in this research is what set apart the high-producing individuals, high-producing organization, high-performing organizations from all the rest. And so I interviewed over 150 CEOs, studied the lives of hundreds of historical figures that have touched our lives, all of our lives. And what we discovered is that even though these people weren't necessarily perfect, all of them were doing at least 12 things in common. And that's what I put in the book, the 12 principles of highly successful leaders. And so these are things that people can learn to do that creates excellence. It's just like the law of gravity. I mean, it's 100%. These are behavioral principles that are just as predictable. And so in answer to your question, there's a lot of things that are very similar to running an organization, a team, a classroom, whatever it might be, as in marriage. So, for example, one of those is to live the golden rule in business and in life. So this is imperative as an organizational leader, a business leader, because if you don't really show respect, if you don't treat people well, they will get back. And it's really difficult to create a culture that is vibrant and alive where they want to be the best in the industry and across the board and have it be sustainable. So living the golden rule is essential in building healthy organizations. Well, that's also essential in having a healthy relationship in a marriage or a partnership or with your children or whatever. So once we start treating people with respect, it's a big game changer. Another one is to highly successful leaders. One of the very first things they do is that they lead with a vision that's inspiring, a vision that is full of purpose and meaning. And so when people in an organization have this, and we see this all over with excellent organizations, I know you have, Jake, anywhere around the world, they have an inspiring vision.
All right, well, we're just barreling right through some of these, my favorite episodes. And finally, we're getting to number 5 here. Let me reintroduce Scott Beebe, guest on episode 40, where we talk about creating an on-purpose business. And in this clip, we specifically dive into the 2 non-negotiables of running a small business.
Jake, a lot of it has to be a draw of motivation. From what we've found, again, this is just experience. Some people may have a different way, but from what we've found, it's a draw of motivation. And what I mean by that is we're not going to guilt people into getting better. I've rarely in my life been guilted into getting better and guilted into progress. Instead, we've been able to work, again, with the heroes that are small business owners to show, hey, let's talk about where you could go. And so let's try to entice you out of apathy. Let's try to entice you out of chaos. You mentioned liberating small business owners from their chaos. One of the reasons that we try to liberate is initially laying out what we call a vision story so that we can, in great detail, articulate what the future of their business looks like. And once they start to get a taste of that, to go, wait a second, I can actually draw this up. And we go, yeah. You can draw it up right now in pages of detail around the future of your family, the future of your finances, the future of your product, your service, your clients, your culture, all those sorts of things. We can lay that out and begin to entice you and kind of draw you out of this chaos into something that is really dynamic. And quite frankly, Jake, it is hard. So we're not out here preaching a gospel of ease. We're out here preaching the message to say, hey, there is something great that God has given you a gift for. And so let's draw that up so you can begin to move towards that instead of drawing up nothing so you just begin to scatter. So I think, Jake, the assumption is the non-negotiables are great accounting structure, great invoicing process, receivable setup, a great advertising piece, those sorts of things. I think these non-negotiables might surprise a couple of people. Some may not. because you realize that you're in the weeds and you look at them and go, oh my goodness, yes, what I would not give for that. Number one, this is the first diagnostic question we ask any heroic small business owner, and it is simply, do you have a vision story written down? I'm not talking about, Jake, a vision story like, hey, we want to be the world's most magnificent brand serving unicorns and jelly beans with a land flowing with milk and honey. I mean, that's, just kind of broad, ethereal, generic thing. I'm talking about specificity. Where are you going as a business? That's number one. And most people they're not going to have that. They haven't taken the time to sit down and write that. But the reason it is a priority is because the proverb is true. Where there is no vision, people scatter. And there's another incredibly powerful Jewish text where it's a prophet named Habakkuk. And as the story goes, God is speaking to him and says, write the vision down so that those who read it may run. Write the vision down so that those who read it may run. And anybody looking for that, you can look in the Old Testament text of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2, and you can actually get that snippet. It's a powerful snippet. And Jake, the reason it is because when you write the vision down, those who read it may run. Now, if I could add on to that, which I'm really leery of doing with anything that's holy and good and all of that, but let me just kind of add on to that. Write the vision down so that those who read it may run towards it or may run away from it. One of the reasons that so many small business owners are in chaos is because they don't have clarifying vision written down. And so some customers, clients, employees that are not a good fit for the business did not get a heads up that they needed to run away from the vision from the get-go. And so they have to now deal with that. They have to deal with a customer that doesn't fit or an employee that doesn't fit because they didn't lay out the vision to begin with to let you decide as a potential customer, as a potential employee, oh my, no, I don't want to be a part of that. Or just the opposite. I have to be a part of that because of the vision you've written down. So that's number one. The second non-negotiable, and again, as crazy as this sounds, it's not a mission statement. It's not an advertising piece. It's not core values. Those are very important. But the second most important non-negotiable is a team meeting structure that is agenda-driven, leader-led, cost-assessed, and is laced with predictability. And so if you've got those things in a team meeting structure, now think about this, Jake. What you've got is you've got a detailed snapshot of where you're going. So now everybody knows where they're going so they can be on the same page. It limits the ability to be scattered. And if you've got a team meeting structure set up, it's no different than my wife and I choosing to have conversation, face-to-face conversation every night. If Ashley and I decided that we were just going to have conversation haphazardly maybe once a month, things would not go well with us. And so why in the world do we think any different within our businesses if we have haphazard human interaction, face-to-face, whether it's live and in person or via Zoom or Skype or whatever, but face-to-face interaction where you're working through situations that arise just like we were talking about earlier. So those are the two non-negotiables that we've seen experientially.
There were so many episodes to comb through when I was making this episode. It was a fun journey to kind of go back and look up all the past guests and kind of listen to their episodes and pull out snippets. And it was just a great experience. It was hard to pick only 5. And of course, to hear the full episodes of these great guests, you can always go back to the website, jakeacarlson.com, put their name in the search bar, and all their information will come up. Or just head to the link, jakeacarlson.com/ML100, and there I'll put all the direct links to the episodes, everything that we talked about today, plus how you can get in touch with Otto, Rabbi Lapin, Whitney, Steve, and Scott. Before I let you go today, one section I've always loved on the podcast is the Learning from Leaders section, where I get to ask the guests a few questions about what they're reading and their superpower and that kind of thing. Since I rarely get the opportunity to share my own responses to these questions, I thought that it would be fun for episode 100 and part of our celebration today to do a little section I call Learning with Jake, where I ask myself those same 4 questions that I ask every guest and let you guys take a peek inside my head and see what's going on in my life right now. So the first question always is the current book. What's on your Kindle or bedside table? And actually, I do almost all of my reading on Kindle. I love to do it digitally. I love to, be able to have the lights off and just read my Kindle. But this is a book the book that's currently on my bedside table, is a book that I actually have the hardcover for. It was given to me as a gift, and the book is called Clockwork, Design Your Business to Run by Itself, and that's by Mike Michalowicz. And if you remember good old Mike Michalowicz, guest on episode 8 of the podcast, he is the author of The Pumpkin Plan, Profit First, The Toilet Paper Entrepreneur, just a great guy and a great writer. I love his style. I always get his books in both print and in the Audible audio format because he reads his own books. And when he reads the books, he adds little stories in there, which make them great. And so the book currently on my bedside table is Clockwork by Mike Michalowicz. The second question is your leadership superpower. And of course, this is my opportunity to plug the free superpower assessment that you can get on jakeacarlson.com. It's right there on the homepage. Just click in the right side. You'll see a picture of a guy opening up his shirt like a superhero, and you can take the 20-question free assessment to find out what leadership platform you lead from. Each of us have different skills and abilities when it comes to leadership. We all have leadership skills. We all have leadership abilities, but this will help you identify the platform that you most strongly lead from. For me, it happens to be adaptability. It's my ability to pivot and do things. It's my ability to think outside the box a little bit and to adapt to changing circumstances. So my leadership superpower, adaptability. The next question, always motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that I live by. Recently I was reading a book by Adam Grant, and you're going to hear it in just a second, Givers and Takers. And in that book, he said something that was very interesting to me. He said, don't measure people by success, rather by effort. Especially when it comes to hiring new people. When you find somebody that's willing to roll up the sleeves, to put their nose to the grind, and to really work hard, to put forth the effort required to learn the skills, almost anything in business we can teach. We can help people get to the level of success as long as they come to you with this effort, with this desire to work hard. And so, whether you're a hirer or being hired, one of the things and one of the philosophies, quotes, or mantras that I've been trying to live by lately is to identify those who are effort takers. Those who will take the effort to be successful rather than looking specifically at past successes. And our final question, the book that you most often gift to friends, family, or colleagues. Well, in this holiday season, I've started gifting a new book, one that's really touched me recently and been impactful for me. And I mentioned it earlier. That's Adam Grant's Givers and Takers. And it's, how do you approach a relationship? Do you approach it as a giver? Or do you approach it in this vein of taker, seeing what you can get? And I hope that you're a giver. But this book has been my most often gifted this holiday season because it's really been impactful for me that givers are not pushovers. They're not doormats. They're people who can lead teams, sales organizations, lead teams, leadership organizations, and really take your business to the next level. And so I love this book, Givers and Takers by Adam Grant. All right. Remember, everything that we talk about on today's episode is going to be found at jakeacarlson.com/ML100 episode 100. And my last bit of advice before I let you go, my daughter was just in the play Mary Poppins. And I went and saw it 3 times, and I just really enjoyed watching her. But one theme stood out to me, and this is my last bit of advice. It was what Mary Poppins said in the very beginning of the show. It became a song and even ended the show talking about it, and that is, anything can happen if you let it. Don't be a barrier to your success. Do the things that we talked about earlier. Set up those 4 steps that we talked about, right? Set a goal that's smart, create a plan of action, put in some sort of accountability, and celebrate your wins. Anything can happen if you let it. Now, of course, you have to work for it. Success isn't just going to come to you, but don't be the barrier to your success. Don't stand in the way. Allow yourself to be a success. Next week, we'll be back with our regularly scheduled program and a great new guest, the founder of Askinosie Chocolate, Mr. Sean Askinosie. But until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. Happy New Year, happy episode 100, and stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.